Welcome to Love Factually, the podcast that analyzes rom-coms and romantic films using the science of close relationships. We're your hosts, Paul Eastwick and Eli Finkel. Eli, what are we talking about today?
Today we are talking about Portrait of a Lady on Fire, Celine Sciamma's ravishing period drama about a forbidden and scorching love affair between two women on a windswept island in 18th century France. The film won Best Screenplay at the 2019 Cannes Film Festival and was listed as the 30th greatest film of all time.
Number 30.
Number 30 in Sight and Sound's Critics Poll in 2022. Some of the themes we'll explore are passionate love, the role of attention, and the development of same-sex attraction.
And fair warning, we will be spoiling this movie today. So if you don't want to know how 18th century you might scrutinize your ex-lover's portrait to find evidence that she's still in love with you, go see this movie and then come back. Okay, so Eli, tell us, who are the key characters and couples in this movie?
The film tracks the love affair between Eloise and Marion. Eloise is a young lady of the gentry who is betrothed against her will to a nobleman. Marion is a talented young artist who has traveled to the remote island because she was commissioned to paint Eloise's portrait, which is to be sent to the nobleman. There are two other notable on-screen characters. There is the Countess, who is Eloise's mother. She is the one who hired Marion and is forcing Eloise into this marriage because in their patriarchal world, that's the only way she can pursue the life that she wants. Finally, there is Sophie. Sophie is the Countess's housemaid. She develops a close friendship with Eloise and Marion during a period when the three of them are alone in the chateau, wherein they collaborate to help Sophie end an unwanted pregnancy. But there are also two important off-screen characters, the mythological newlyweds Orpheus and Eurydice. According to legend, after Eurydice is killed by a snake, the grief-stricken Orpheus plays a song of such heart-rending beauty that Hades himself allows Eurydice to accompany Orpheus back to the living world. The only condition is that Orpheus cannot look back at her on the journey. But he begins to fear that Hades has tricked him, that Eurydice isn't actually walking behind him, and that his return to the living world will mean that he's lost his only chance to retrieve her from death. So he turns to look at her, an act that traps her forever in Hades' realm. So, those are the chess pieces. Paul, can you give us 1 minute on how Sciamma moves them across the board?
All right, count me down.
On your mark, get set, go.
In the late 1700s, a young painter named Marion arrives at a chateau on the French coast because she has been commissioned by the Countess of the chateau to paint a portrait of her daughter Eloise. At first, Eloise is unwilling to pose for a portrait because the portrait will be used to cement her marriage to an Italian nobleman she has no interest in marrying. Marion pretends to be a walking companion for Eloise and tries to observe her features in secret and do her painting at night. Eventually, as the two develop a friendship, Marion can't keep up the ruse. She shows Eloise the painting. Eloise doesn't think much of it. Marion destroys it, and before Marion can be fired, Eloise finally agrees to pose for the portrait properly. Now we head to the key stretch of the film where the Countess leaves the chateau for 5 days and things become romantic and sexual between Eloise and Marion as Marion paints Eloise. But everything has an air of impermanence with discussions about how they will remember their brief time together, and when the Countess returns, Marion has to say goodbye to Eloise quickly and tragically in a scene that parallels the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice.
Hey, well done. 58 and a half seconds. Bravo, bravo. Okay, my man, tell me, what is your relationship with this movie?
So, I saw this movie shortly after it came out, thought it was pretty terrific. This was the first time I've revisited it in the last 5 years. I have to say I found it even more compelling this time around. And I think, I listened to an interview with the director and she talked about how much she was inspired by movies like Mulholland Drive, which might seem like an odd comparison. Yeah. I mean, it is also a lesbian love story, but, is strange and Lynchian in all its ways. But I think what I love Mulholland Drive too, and I think what these movies have in common is that they do not reveal everything on a first watch.
No, they don't.
They reward persistence and repeat viewings, and I definitely got that out of it this time.
Yeah, I mean, this is art with a capital A. It's not going to reveal itself without a whole lot of thinking. I had an interesting relationship with the movie. So same with me. I saw it once when it came out. I very much enjoyed re-immersing myself in it. I was particularly intrigued by the question that Eloise asks at some point when she says, do all lovers feel they're inventing something?
Yeah.
And I think, one of the things I've been focusing on a lot in the relationship space these days is the idea of a microculture, the idea that we are building something that is uniquely ours. And in fact, people do this, right? They have their own unique language and pet names for each other, things that some of the things might even not make sense or even seem insulting from the outside. And the movie does a nice job. I don't know if you remember late in the movie, Eloise is a little difficult to crack. I mean, both of these women are tough, sort of fierce women and a little difficult to crack. And then they really do fall deeply in love with each other. And she says near the end, they realize time is running out. And she says, I feel something new, regret. And Marion says, don't regret, remember. I'll remember when you fell asleep in the kitchen. I'll remember your dark look when I beat you at cards. I'll remember the first time you laughed. And there is something that is, with regard to this question, are all lovers inventing something? I think the answer is yes. They're inventing us. They're inventing a relationship, an entity that has never existed before. And it's a very exciting feature of the movie to me.
Yeah, I can totally see how that would resonate with you given your interests. And it's one of the aspects of the movie that also strikes me as especially true. And let's segue right into what the movie gets right. I mean, this is certainly one of the things that the movie seems to understand is the way that this microculture is built very slowly and gradually. But what other kinds of things did you have that the movie gets right about the nature of close relationships?
I mean, it played on painted on a broad canvas, let's say. There were a lot of different ideas in here. I mean, I think the lowest hanging fruit in terms of things that the movie got right involved the nature of romantic love. Did it depict the experience of falling deeply, head over heels, passionately in love with somebody in those opening days of that experience? And I think it did a really good job. And I'd like to highlight a couple of the things that really stood out to me. One of the major ones is like the immense need we have when we're deeply in love for reciprocity.
Yep.
And the part that really popped for me in this sense, you might remember that they had their first kiss and they're in some sort of cave or near a cliff right next to the gorgeous seaside. And right after they kiss the first time, Eloise runs away. And then Marion gets to dinner that evening, and Sophie's there, and it's just the two of us, and Eloise is nowhere to be seen. And this is the first time that's happened.
It's terrifying.
It's so terrifying. And Marion, these are very buttoned up, dignified people, and so she sort of casually says, where is Eloise? And Sophie says, well, she's not feeling well, she's not joining us, and you're not seeing it because she's dignified, but she must be absolutely roiled on the inside.
Right. I know what that panic feels like.
Too.
And it was all over her face, but it's just the smallest little movements. I mean, these people are so good at this.
They are so good. The writing, the directing, the acting, and the other part, and maybe you noted some other elements too. I mean, the depiction of romantic love was very, very persuasive, I thought. One of the other features that came to mind is that they sort of know they're on borrowed time. They know that they don't have that much time, and they have this feeling at the end that you could sort of predict, but is, I think, essential to the idea that you've loved in a deep, passionate way and you're going to lose. And both of them think, I wasted time, right? Yeah. They can look back and think, what on earth was I doing other than immersing myself in the beauty of you and of us? And that too strikes me as very true about what it feels like to be in love.
Well, this dovetails with one of the things that I thought the movie got quite right. And this borrows from some of Lisa Diamond's research. Lisa Diamond is really one of our foremost expert researchers on the development of same-sex sexual attraction. And she has, some really important theoretical work that goes back several decades now, where she talks about the importance of conceptually separating attraction in a sexual way, and the fact that people tend to, on average, have an attraction sexually that is oriented, right? That's how she talks about it. So it can be oriented toward men or it can be oriented toward women. But she also talks about a passionate love system that is not intrinsically oriented in the same way. So another way of saying all of this is that we can be passionate about somebody who might not be the gender that we would typically be sexually attracted to. And that passionate system is really activated and brought to the fore by time, togetherness, and touch, right? Those are the three things that she talks about.
Yeah.
And she talks about at various points throughout history, and the movie is giving us an illustration that fits with this characterization of people put into circumstances where they spend a lot of time together, okay? And it's intimate time together.
Yep.
And there's also touch involved too. I mean, the moments where Marianne is sort of touching Eloise as she's sort of getting her to pose properly. I mean, it's all in here. And the point that Lisa Diamond makes vis-a-vis same-sex attraction is that, many times the passionate feelings come first and kind of carry the sexual attraction with it. And so you first feel passionate love for somebody who would not typically be the somebody of the gender that you're sexually attracted to, but then the sexual attraction comes later.
So it's intriguing. So what you're saying is that you can develop the feelings of passion, things like I can't stop thinking about her, I think all the time about whether she's into me, and it's only after I develop those feelings that a real sense of sexual attraction or lust starts to come about.
Right. And I think that's what's such an important part of understanding the passionate love experience is that it doesn't always feature a strong sexual attraction component, right? That the intrusive thinking and that the, sort of really wanting to have your feelings reciprocated by the other person, sex is not always a part of that, and sometimes it develops later. And so the many cases where you see people developing same gender relationships, even though they previously would not have identified as somebody who would have same gender attractions, how these things can develop. And so I feel like this movie is really showcasing those ideas.
Yeah, that can develop. And in this particular movie, that like all of it develops pretty quickly because the whole time they have together is like 12 days or something like that.
Right. So it is a very compressed period of time.
Yeah. When you were talking about how Marianne's responsible for posing Eloise for the portrait, I was reminded of one of the key themes in the movie, and also one of the key themes in relationship science, is this idea of focused attention, right? Yeah. And I don't know if you noted this, but on a rewatch, I watched it a couple times recently, I noticed that the first word of the film, obviously it's translated from the French, but the first word is attention.
Yeah.
And the reason why is because Marianne's talking to her art class. This is maybe a decade or so later, 5-10 years maybe later. And she's saying attention, right? Like you need to pay attention if you want to be a good artist. And she's saying like, check out the contours of my body, right? If you're painting me as a subject. And the closing line, which Marianne offers in voiceover while she's watching Eloise, who is watching the symphony, is she didn't see me. Right, that's the closing line. So the first one is attention, and the last one is she didn't see me. And then, of course, the climactic moment of the film, which is a variation on Orpheus and Eurydice's story, Eloise instructs Marianne to turn around, that is, to look at her. And this idea that attention, focused attention, is one of the key components of what it means to care about somebody, to attend to somebody, to see individuals in their uniqueness. It's a core theme, again, in the movie and in relationship science. And I'm very embedded or invested in this idea. And if we take a much less serious, point of view, we can adopt Oprah Winfrey. So at the end of her 25 years of her show, it's like, what have you learned? And it's like, well, what does everybody want to be asked? What does everybody want to know? she's interviewed everybody, right? And it's like,
Yeah,
number
right.
1, do you see me? Number 2, do you hear me? And number 3, does what I say mean anything to you? And this literature, I think, is in the scholarly space, I think this is best captured by Harry Reese's idea of responsiveness, which, as you know, may be like the core concept in relationship psychology. And
It's pretty close.
Pretty close, yeah. And Harry Reese defines this responsiveness as a combination of feeling understood, validated, and cared for. And what do those things mean? So understanding is we believe that our partner is aware of our core features. Validation is we believe that our partner values our characteristics and hopes and goals. And 3, cared for means that we believe our partner is actively engaged in helping us achieve those important aspirations. And the process of deeply focusing our attention on someone else, not just sort of like gandering over there and then like getting distracted by our phone, but deep focused engagement is, I think, one of the core themes in the movie, especially because obviously Marianne is focusing on Eloise while painting her, but Eloise is focusing on Marianne while being painted. And they are just deeply invested in understanding and seeing, in the literal and metaphorical sense, each other.
I also picked up on the attention component throughout this movie, and where it really jumped out to me was the way that their eyes would trace, there'd be these shots where they're, both of their faces are in the shot and they're sort of looking at each other, and their eyes are just sort of tracing each other's faces up and down, right? They just feel like they're trying to like scan and memorize each other in those moments. And then again, before they've consummated anything, sometimes their eyes meet and then break away, and then sometimes their eyes meet and then break away. And this is very well established in the flirting literature. I was reminded of the research going back several decades by Monica Moore, who looked at how women flirted. I mean, that was really the focus of her research, was what did women do when they wanted to flirt? And gaze was one of the most common things that would emerge. And it would be most commonly something she called the short darting glance, right?
Nice.
So look over and look away, look over, look away.
Give me one.
Happening in rapid section, rapid succession.
Yeah.
And then the gaze fixation would be another one too, right? Which is much more intimate, but really fixing your gaze on somebody else's eyes and holding it just a beat too long. What I also found totally fascinating about the parallels with that research is that, again, in flirting, you're trying to get somebody's attention. You might hold their gaze for, an extra beat, a few extra seconds, right? To demonstrate interest, to see if they're interested in you, right? Do they hold your gaze for that same extra beat?
Yes.
But it's also interesting to consider that in developing intimacy, one of the techniques that has often been used is get people to stare into each other's eyes.
It's weirdly awkward and persuasive.
Right. And what my understanding is that if you can do it for a sustained period of time, like minutes, it really it gets deep and it gets weird and it gets interesting.
And you feel close to the person.
And you feel close to the person. But this was part of the famous Art Aaron 36 questions development of intimacy study. So for those of you who haven't heard about Art Aaron's intimacy paradigm, he basically developed these 36 questions that escalate in intimacy, right? They move from relatively surface level things. It's still a bit deeper than small talk, but relatively surface level things. To getting into some pretty deep stuff about, deep-seated fears that you have, but also getting people to talk about what is something that you really like about this person that you've just met.
Yeah.
There is also a prolonged eye contact portion of this procedure too.
Have you ever done it?
Understand it.
Like, have you ever been?
I confess I have not.
I was going to say, I presume that we've done some of this with significant others.
I've certainly done the
lives.
questions. The questions are really interesting. If if you had a crystal ball that could tell you anything about your life or your future, what would you want to ask it? I mean, the questions are fascinating. They're good for developing intimacy. But I confess I've never done the prolonged eye contact with this.
freaked out. Like if you and I were actually like in the same room right now and it was like, all right, let's just do that for 3 minutes. Like I'd be scared to do it. It's like too intimate.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
But as escalating flirting,
it works.
I'm in.
So I also wanted to talk about Art Aaron, give him some love. But before I do, I want to give some love to Monica Moore, the person you mentioned who did that flirting research. Like, it's cool work. Like this was in the 1980s, and the assumption was like that men are the assertive ones, and women sort of wait to be approached. And she was like, no, that's true, but women are hardly passive. And she was interested in understanding what people do, and then what women did in order to increase the odds that they were approached by men that they wanted to be approached by. And it's a real credit to scientific approaches to dealing with this stuff. She went to bars and surreptitiously watched people and figured out like what did women do in the moments before they were approached versus the moments where they weren't approached. And it's just big credit where it's due there. So on the topic of Art Aaron, or credit where it's due to Art Aaron. Art Aaron and Elaine Aaron are perhaps best known for self-expansion theory, which they've been developing over the last several decades. And there's a bunch of key components of self-expansion theory. One basic assumption of the theory is that all of us have some desire to grow the self, that is, to have the self-concept expand over time. And one of the main ways that we do it, according to the theory, is that we self-expand when we fall in love. And we see this, right? So Eloise is very moved by music. Sort of like, Marianne is a visual artist. Eloise is an auditory artist. She loves music. She, in fact, sings. And she's got this relatively limited palette of music experience. And Marianne introduces her to orchestral music and plays for her on the harpsichord Vivaldi's Storm. And one of the beautiful things about the movie is that this is the music that brings Eloise to heartbroken rapture in the scenes, in the movie's final scene. But it reminds me of this idea, this idea from self-expansion theory, that one of the ways that we can grow is through our relationship, and this is what's happening in that scene. That Marianne is introducing Eloise to a way of thinking about music that is new and different, and what the theory suggests is that there's this nice interplay between the growth of the self through the relationship and the feelings of romantic love. And you may recall the sort of classic study, the 1995 article from Art Aaron and his colleagues, where they studied college freshmen and they surveyed them every 2 weeks over the course of an academic term. And they just asked them each time, like, in the last 2 weeks, have you fallen in love? And they had this pretty creative way of trying to assess the size of the self-concept. They had people list, like, what are the aspects of your self-concept? And what they found is that as people fell in love, that is, if this were one of the surveys where you had fallen in love over the last 2 weeks, the list of your self-concept attributes is longer. And I think the film does another thing that reflects interestingly on self-expansion theory. So one of the things that really struck me about the film is Eloise starts talking about painting as something that we are doing. And Marianne doesn't seem at all turned off by that. And in fact, there's a moment when Eloise says, get your things, we're going to paint. And then later, when they're looking at the second portrait, which both of them like, they're looking at it and Eloise says, how do we know when it's finished? And Marianne says, at some point we stop, as if the painting is being done by the pair of them. And in their assessment of the second portrait, Eloise says, this time I like it. And Marianne says, perhaps because I know you better. And Eloise says, perhaps I've changed. And there is a real sense in which, yes, they're growing through self-expansion, but they are also blurring the boundaries between who you are and who I am. That is, the self-concept is literally starting to blur in terms of which one of us, again, was the painter. Not that they can't understand it in some way, but when they think of their identity, they think we are painting this portrait. And in a very interesting way, it's true.
And all of these things are connected in the Art Aaron universe, right? Yeah. It's like the self-expansion is connected to the sense of like of you and me are doing things together, right? We are like this. It's not you and me as separate entities. And then all of that is linked to passionate feelings. So all of these things are typically tied up nicely and all work together very well in this movie. Are there any misconceptions about relationships that you spotted in this movie?
I mean, not major ones. I do have a bit. Do you want to get us started on this one?
Boy, mine are really descending into nitpicking. The only one that I would suggest, and this isn't like a misconception, it's just like, hey, everybody, it usually doesn't happen this quickly.
Right.
It's more of like hey, don't set your expectations that most 5-day experience, right? It's 5 days that the Countess is gone.
Yeah.
So this level of earth and time-shattering love that changes you forever usually takes longer than 5 days. But that's not to say it can't happen in 5 days. So for me to call it a misconception, right, it absolutely can. So calling it a misconception isn't really correct, but it is much more common that these things unfold more gradually. I'm going to stop talking about it because, again, it feels like nitpicking from the scientific perspective, but people should not generally expect things to be this earth-shattering this quickly.
It's interesting. I totally agree. And I, most of the time we start relationships with people that we've known for a while. But it is conceivable to me that it's one of these, like going bankrupt, right? It's like slowly and then all at once. Right.
Slowly,
and it might be that even though these things tend to develop slowly, like that there is a gusher of passion that emerges, and it just probably doesn't emerge in the first week, but that when it starts to emerge, it can actually start to emerge quickly. I wonder if that's the case.
I would also buy the idea that when you're this isolated and this level of sort of the time and the togetherness really can exacerbate that. That would be my guess.
Mine. Go ahead.
No. What did you have?
Mine too are in the category of like there was something kind of outliery about the way this went, and basically I think it's like these are really impressive people, both Eloise and Marianne, and in particular, they seem to have such profound mastery of their own emotions, but I think we have to believe they have very little experience with this. And so the idea that they would be so on top. Yeah, so on top of these things. And like Marianne in particular is so courageous, right? So like she kisses, they have their first kiss, and Eloise just storms off and then doesn't show up to dinner. And I think a lot of people would feel very abashed and upset and go up to the room and cry and feel rejected. And Marianne does the opposite. She walks right up to Eloise's room and she kisses her on the neck. And again, it's pretty heroic. Sandra Murray and John Holmes have this work on risk regulation. They say that, well, when people have really high self-esteem, they're pretty good about drawing closer when they feel vulnerable. And let's just say that Marianne, I think, is an extreme case of high self-esteem or whatever that is that says, even when I'm feeling rejected, I'm going to come to you and express my affection and be vulnerable.
You are totally right that this is not a movie about two people fumbling through an intense but unknown experience. They are acting like they've been here before.
Yeah.
Most people have to go through the passionate experience and having it blow up in their face before they can act with this much grace throughout the arc.
It's
that
heroic.
We witness.
It's heroic to the point
really is.
That I thought, I don't know if this is realistic, or at the very least, these are very, very special people.
That is an excellent, excellent point. Are we okay with everything in this movie? Was there anything that struck you as particularly challenging or eyebrow-raising?
It's interesting because I think we initially added this category because we thought, those 80s and 90s movies, like they don't age well, and how homophobic a lot of them were, and of course they were. Yeah. And this is sort of the opposite. Like if there's ever been a less homophobic movie, I mean, I still think there are some intriguing things that are not front and center in the movie, but I think are present. So what's the right way for us to think of the page 28 thing? So again, just as a reminder, they know they're going going to be separated. Neither one of them wants to be separated. Eloise is going to go on and get married and have children. And Eloise asks Marianne that last night, like, paint basically a nude of yourself. It's like, send me a nude, the 18th century version of Send Me a Nude. And it's on page 28 of her book. And later, when, when Marianne is at a museum show, she sees a beautiful portrait of Eloise with her daughter, and Eloise is holding a book open to page 28. So my question for you is Eloise betraying her husband and family? I have to say, it's a little hard for me to come up with the answer that she is not. On the other hand, the structure, the hetero-patriarchal structure of the society doesn't give her a whole lot of choice. So how do we wait?
Right.
Is it acceptable what Eloise is doing? That is, carrying a torch for somebody other than her husband and clearly conveying that in a way that Marianne will know that's happening.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I didn't spot. I think got swept up with the romanticism of it all, and with that moment where she sees that it's page 28 and
it's beautiful.
Marianne just has this look on her face like, thank the Lord that you are still thinking about me all these years later the way that I'm still thinking about you. And as an audience, you're often rooting for that thing. You're rooting for the torch to be carried, right? And I'm not giving much thought to this Italian nobleman. I think you bring up a very interesting point, especially as applied to maybe a more typical movie where we actually would spend time with so-and-so nobleman, and maybe he's an okay guy, and maybe he's trying to give Eloise the best life that he can. I mean, we just have no information about him whatsoever. It is very clear that she is not interested in this marriage at all. So that's why this particular version of it didn't bother me. But the broader issue of why do we, the audience, always root for the torch to be carried rather than, learning to love the person that you end up with, I do think is a really fascinating question. I'm sure we're going to get into some movies that do that in a way that, if you think about it, inspires real conflict.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is fair to ask, if this were your spouse and your spouse was posing for a portrait, and whether you knew it or not, was like still carrying an absolutely intense flame for their ex and conveying that in the only means at her disposal, I suspect many of us would be upset. Again, we don't know. Maybe they have an understanding and it's not a big deal, but I think many of us would feel upset, and the movie just elides this whole issue.
Yeah, but I kind of feel like, well, wait a minute, but she actually had no choice in marrying me. Fuck me. I mean,
that's why
what the fuck right do I have?
That's why I think it's complicated. No, I totally agree.
Yeah.
That's why I framed it in terms of the sort of heteropatriarchy norms here. But I still think it's a valid question. Like, what does she, even in a context like that, what does she owe her partner? And I have a second version that's sort of related to that, which is like, how are we supposed to evaluate the Countess? She is, more generally, how do we evaluate people who make moral compromises in order to have a relatively good life within a system that they don't control? So the Countess has very little power over what she does because she's a woman in that society in that time, and she really wants to get back to Milan, and realizes that the way she can do that is to force her daughter to marry this nobleman in Milan. And how are we to evaluate her? On one hand, I feel disturbed that she's contributing. She's like a handmaiden of the patriarchy. And on the other hand, I feel like, well, what's she supposed to do? So you tell me, is it okay that she's, pushing this to have the life that she wants, even though her daughter doesn't want it? Or is it unacceptable for her to do it, even if it means that the system is making it so she can't live the life that she herself wants to live?
I mean, from a 21st century lens sitting here today, it seems absolutely egregious and outrageous.
Completely,
right?
No doubt. Yeah.
And so I think from the perspective of the movie is speaking to us, again, in the 21st century and saying, this is outrageous, what people used to do, right? Yes. That people would marry off their children, threaten to do it, and we didn't really talk about this, but first the Countess attempts to marry off the older sister who commits suicide to not have to do it. And then she's like, okay, well, I'll do it again with my younger daughter.
Yeah.
I'll just maybe like try to keep more of an eye on her. I mean, I think the movie is clear that I mean, well, this is a kind of thing people used to do, but also this is pretty abhorrent. That's not to say that we're not supposed to think that the Countess is an inhuman character. She is, I think, responding to the incentives of her time. But we're, I think, supposed to get that this is pretty barbaric stuff. What I always find challenging is, okay, but how do we think about people living 200-300 years ago who really did these things? And I'm always drawn to the idea of, or I'm always drawn to want to try to know what was the variability in this kind of behavior? Was it like, pretty much all rich countesses were doing this? There was no alternative. Or is it, no, there were alternatives. There were people who didn't marry off their daughters this way. It's just this countess really wanted to be in Milan, and she was going to use her daughters to do it.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes understanding moral frameworks across time, I find it useful to understand what the variability was. Oh, these, horrible licentious professors of 50 years ago. Oh, but times were different. Yeah, but were all professors licentious back then? I don't think they were. So there was variability. There were other directions that people could have gone. At least that's how I think about these things.
Totally fascinating all around. So were there any quotes from the movie that you think are enlightening or interesting from the perspective of relationships or relationship science?
You happen to have plucked them out already, but I'll just re-shout out one of them because I loved it so much, which was the... do you think all lovers feel like they're inventing something? And you brought it up in the context early on in this conversation about microculture, right? Two people building a set of rituals, pet names, norms together. But I also think that it speaks to something deep and, dare I say, evolved about what the passionate experience is like. That part of passionate love is feeling like I can only have these experiences with this person.
Yes.
And it doesn't feel like I have been here before, right? Even if you literally have gone through that same experience previously, it doesn't feel that way. It feels like this can only happen with this person right here, right now. And that's the thing that I really took from that quote, was this idea that that this is this wholly new thing that has never existed in the world, and it is right here between the two of us, and it will never exist between any other two people who have ever lived. And I'm like, yes, that is what it feels like.
Yes. One of the things we haven't really spoken about, and I think is largely neglected in the relationships world, so my quote will actually segue into what do I wish we knew. But let me give the quote first. So they're evaluating the first portrait, the one that's sort of generic, right? So the first time Marianne creates a very beautiful portrait of Eloise, but she's sort of a generic, sort of attractive lady. And there's nothing that really pops about her authenticity or her idiosyncrasy. And Eloise says, "Is that how you see me?" She's just so disappointed that Marianne sees her as this vanilla. And Marianne says, "It's not only me." And Eloise says, "What do you mean, not only you?" Marianne says, "There are rules, conventions, ideas." And Eloise says, "You mean there's no life, no presence?" Marianne says, "Your presence is made up of fleeting moments that may lack truth." Eloise says, "Not everything is fleeting. Not everything is fleeting. Some feelings are deep." And then at the end of the film, Marianne is presenting her, glorious painting of Orpheus and Eurydice, and a patron offers this analysis. Usually he, that is Orpheus, is portrayed before he turns or after, as Eurydice dies. Here they seem to be saying goodbye. And I'm really intrigued by this idea that there's these evanescent, fleeting, powerful experiences that we have in relationships. And what are we to make of them, right? These quotes were very thought-provoking to me, because there is no question that the present becomes the past every instant. And does that mean that, well, yeah, experiences are fleeting? Or does that mean, no, we capture them in some meaningful way? And this sort of gets to the nature of memory, and that, I think, is another one of the themes in the film.
Totally fascinating. You know, one of the things that struck me as missing from the relationships literature, the relationships space more broadly, that was captured really well in the movie, was this idea of how people manage breakups, or how people manage the end of the affair, right? And I think, you know, breakup is the term that we often have for when relationships end, because we scientists often think about relationships as it was this thing and it was official and we agreed that we were a couple and we were together for X amount of time. And, you know, if we were together for until the end of the study, we're considered a success. And if we break up, that's considered a failure. And that is very distinct from what we're seeing here, where most of their mental lives together will be spent apart throughout the rest of their lives as they remember the time that they have together. And so what I want to know is, how is that done in a way that is fulfilling and joy-inducing, and not, you know, that doesn't make somebody bitter, that doesn't make somebody inconsolably sorrow, or becomes a kind of experience that they never really get over. You know, most of the time when we talk about what makes for a good breakup, it's have a narrative for why your partner is a jerk, and why your former partner is a jerk, and why your current partner is better, right? And I'm sure that is correct much of the time, but what we're totally missing is, how do people think about past lost loves in a like fulfilling and sort of soul nourishing way? In a way that I think we see in both those final scenes of the movie, both when Marianne sees the portrait of Eloise and sees the page open, sees the book open to page 28, and when Marianne is seeing Eloise listening to Vivaldi and experiencing all those emotions on her face. And this seems to be a healthy way of thinking about an ended affair that doesn't involve thinking that the partner is the worst person in the world. Yeah,
I mean, you are right that to a significant extent, our field sort of treats relationships as like a light switch. It's like, well, there was an instant where it happened, and then there was an instant where it didn't happen, like it went off, and you know that's how we're going to construe it. One of the things that I wish we knew more, and I found very, provocative about the movie, is like the experience versus the memory of love, and this was related to the quote I offered, and Marianne, when Marianne and Eloise and Sophie are reading the Eurydice, the Orpheus and Eurydice legend, they're trying to unpack, like, why does he look back? Why does Orpheus look back at Eurydice? And there's various views, and I liked Marianne's a lot. He says he chooses the memory of her. That's why he turns. He doesn't make the lover's choice, but the poet's. Yeah. And I actually got chills just sort of like rereading that. I am intrigued by this idea that there could be this, I guess, maybe poetic, but this way of thinking about relationship, about one's relationship, that's really about memory. That's really about having a set of experiences that aren't really about what we're going through right now, but the memories that we're creating together. And as I'm talking here, I'm realizing that to some degree, I think this is what parents do. right? You want to make sure that your kids have had certain sorts of experiences for sure, but then the way we talk to our kids, we try to like make sure that they like flagged something happened here that's worth remembering, and like here's how to think about it. And so I don't think we know very well as a field what to do with the fact that there is the experience that people have, and then instantaneously that experience fades into the past, and how the experience versus the memory of the experiences, interface in our experiences of love.
I mean, what if the ways of creating sort of a long-lasting, happy relationships are to flag those moments like that, or the ways to feel good about the end of something?
Yep.
That you flag the memorable experiences along the way, so that you have the memories later, because ultimately that's all you're going to have. I mean, I kind of struggled with the different interpretations of the Orpheus Eurydice myth. Because it would seem to me like, obviously, you choose the lover's route. You choose to spend more time with the person. Like, what on earth are you doing? Yeah. But I agree with you. There is something deep about the idea that, but in the end, what we have are memories. So let's make them good ones.
Yeah. Can I post one other thing that the movie made me think about that I wish we knew? Yeah. They have, because everything is so condensed in terms of time, because literally they have something like 12 days together. Yeah. I'm curious about this idea of like the anticipation versus the actual culmination or consummation of sexual desire. I feel like we don't really have a feel for this. So for example, imagine an alternate world where they had the same amount of sexual desire but never got together. Like, what do we think? Like, do we think that the amount of passion and love for each other would have been less, would have been more? In general, like they want to consummate the passion that they're feeling, but what we don't really know is how does the experience of that consummation affect the trajectory of the relationship itself? I know that you don't have data relevant to that in particular, but you do have data relevant to how the arcs of relationships change once people start getting to like actual physical sexual contact.
That's right. And usually it's the case that when people have some sort of sexual contact, that is in relationships that are going well, or that are bound to go well, that moment is usually sort of a catapulting point, right? That's consistent with some of the sexual afterglow ideas too, right?
From Andrea Meltzer and others, yeah.
Exactly. Like having a good sexual experience then leads you to feel more positively about somebody. So that's what I'd expect to happen here in general. But I love this idea that you're talking about. Okay, so you've got these affairs that have ended, and some had sexual consummation of some kind and some didn't. Yeah. And is there a distinction there that's meaningful? I don't really know.
Or you could imagine a study. I mean, these would be hard studies to run, practical and maybe ethical constraints. But you could imagine a study where, you recruited only people who were like really passionately falling for somebody but hadn't really gotten sexual with them yet. And you randomly assign half of them to like get it on soon, and the other half like please don't get it on, and you follow up with them a month later. Do you have a hypothesis about like which of those two groups, if either, will like feel closer to each other, more in love with each other a month later?
I think if you're randomly assigning it, it's going to be the people who you're randomly assigning to have more rather than less intimacy, right? The intimacy is physical, the intimacy is emotional. More rather than less, I think, is going to boost things if we're really doing a proper randomly assigned stuff.
I think that's right. More intimacy is better than less. There is another element here, which is the nature of craving. Right? Sexual, passionate feelings are like a craving, and you can sort of slake them to some degree. And so the question is like...
See, I don't really buy this.
Do you not buy this?
Not really. I think more begets more.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, this gets into... for the audience, Eli and I argue all about the Coolidge effect.
The Coolidge effect, yeah.
The goddamn Coolidge effect. So the Coolidge effect, for those of you, actually, can you do this this tale well? I don't know if I can.
Yeah, the Coolidge effect is it's named after President Coolidge, and he and his wife were visiting a farm, and he was in meetings, and the farmer was giving a tour of the farm to Mrs. Coolidge, and Mrs. Coolidge, when they got to the hen house, Mrs. Coolidge said, "Whoa, do you mean to say that the rooster has sex with all of those hens every day, like 20 times a day?" And, sort of slyly says, "Well, why don't you tell that to Mr. Coolidge?" And then later, the guy was walking around and said, "Look, I feel a little awkward saying this to you, President, but your wife wanted me to mention that rooster can go 20 times in a day." And he said, "Well, is it the same hen every time or a different hen?" He said, "Well, it's a different hen every time." And he said, "Tell that to Mrs. Coolidge." That's why it's called the Coolidge effect.
Right. So sometimes it's used as a desire for sexual variety. Fine. But it's also sometimes used to illustrate the idea that once you've consummated with one person, you would prefer to consummate with somebody else. Maybe this especially applies to men, whatever. But that is the implication that I find absolutely absurd.
In the ensuing few hours. But you know what, as you're characterizing it now, I'm finding you persuasive.
Yes, I finally won this argument. Okay, so we like to rate each of these movies on how many stars we give it in terms of movie quality from 1 to 5 stars, and we don't do half stars here. So, Eli, how many stars do you give?
5, only because I can't give it more. I mean, it was a beautiful, major work of art.
Yeah, of course it's a 5-star movie. Yeah. And I can't, I just watched it and I can't wait to watch it again.
Yeah, same here.
But we also award Rust Bolts. The Rust Bolt is named after Eli's advisor, the late, great Carol Rust Bolt, pioneer of close relationships research, with 5 stars indicating a near-perfect depiction of the nature of close relationships. And I also give this movie 5 Rust Bolts. 5
stars from you, 5 Rust Bolts from you.
5 stars, yeah.
I'm giving this one 4 Rust Bolts.
Okay, interesting.
Not because I think it's inaccurate in some way, but because it's illustrating a pretty idiosyncratic set of circumstances that I think will apply to very few people. So I think they get the psychology of this idiosyncratic situation. That would have been a 5 for me, but I think that there's a lot of things about this that don't apply to many people much of the time.
That's interesting. And you almost moved me off of the 5 with your discussion about, these are some remarkable people who seem to be able to handle everything. But you know what? Then as I thought more about all of the amazing things they get right in this movie, I just had to go back to 5. Respect. So here I am sitting at 5. But this has been the Love Factually podcast. I am Paul Eastwick here with Eli Finkel. And Eli, it has been a delight doing this with you, and I will see you next time.
I am looking forward to it. The Love Factually podcast is produced and edited by Paul Eastwick and Eli Finkel, featuring music from Andrew Fraker and Sons.